This has been a disaster for Harry reputationally and financially. Look at how Harry has behaved when he didn't need the money. He writes the book Spare, then we have the Netflix documentary, and of course, the Oprah interview. So, that's Harry in a good mood.
The headline everyone ran with was a number, £34.5 million, splashed across feeds, chewed over on panel shows, treated like a bill that landed on Prince Harry's doormat with his name printed at the top. Here is the reality that most of that coverage skipped right past. That figure is not a court order against Harry. It is not a personal invoice. It is what Associated Newspapers told a London court its own legal costs came to. Big difference. And the gap between those two things is the whole story. Let me lay out what actually happened, because the drama makes more sense once you separate what a court ruled from what the internet decided it meant. On the 7th of July, 2026, the High Court dismissed the claims brought by 7 claimants against Associated Newspapers Limited. That is the direct fact, straight from the official judgment in Lawrence and others against Associated Newspapers. Harry was one of those 7. So was Baroness Doreen Lawrence. So were a handful of famous names who had lent their profile to the fight, and every one of those claims fell. Now, for years this case was sold to the public as something enormous, a reckoning, a grand confrontation between a wronged prince and a newspaper group he accused of unlawful behavior. The rhetoric was loud, the framing was moral. The language pointed toward a battle over press intrusion, over privacy, over the treatment of a family Harry has spent years describing as victims of the media. That was the public campaign. That was the version built for interviews and documentaries and the court of opinion. A court of law works differently. A courtroom does not run on grievance. It does not care how sympathetic your story sounds or how many millions of people feel for you. It runs on proof. And when this case reached the point where proof was required, the campaign and the case turned out to be 2 very different animals. One lived on emotion, the other had to meet a legal burden. Only one of them survived contact with the evidence. That is the piece the loudest coverage never quite explained. A public narrative can be powerful, moving, even persuasive to millions, and still collapse the moment a judge asks the plain question, where is the proof? Rhetoric is not a substitute for evidence once a case reaches judgment. You can hold a press conference, you can write a memoir, you can sit for a Netflix series and an Oprah special. None of that changes what a claimant has to demonstrate inside a courtroom, and in this instance, the demonstration did not hold. So the dismissal on the 7th of July was not the tidy ending some assumed. Losing did not close the book, it opened a second one. Because a lost case does not simply vanish, it carries a consequence, and that consequence has a price attached to it. When you bring a group of high-profile claims against a major newspaper group and those claims are thrown out, someone has to answer for the cost of the whole exercise. The winning side does not just walk away satisfied, it comes looking for its money.
Let's hope that the jam business is going to do really well this year, because after losing his very high-profile court case against the Daily Mail in association with Sir Elton John, Dame Baroness Lawrence, Elizabeth Hurley and others, they've been asked to pay all the costs of the Daily Mail's legal costs.
That is where the £34.5 million figure enters the picture, and where the real fight moved to after the verdict. Which raises the obvious question, if the claims were dismissed, why exactly did the court say they failed? The answer sits in the judgment itself, and it is worth understanding precisely, because this is where the campaign met the case and lost. The court required the claimants to prove that the published information had been obtained through unlawful information gathering, not to allege it, not to suggest it felt likely, to prove it. And on that standard, the claims did not clear the bar. Here is the line that matters most, stated as plainly as the court stated it. Suspicion is not proof. You can suspect something happened. You can believe it in your bones. You can be personally convinced that a story about you could only have come from some improper source. But belief is not the currency a courtroom accepts. The claimants had to show that the information behind these articles was gathered unlawfully, and suspicion, however deeply felt, could not carry that weight. Think about what that means for the way this case was pursued. The campaign framed the newspaper group as an institution defined by intrusion. That was the mood music for years. But a court does not judge mood music. It judges specific allegations attached to specific articles, and it asks for specific evidence behind each one. The grand framing does not travel into the courtroom, only the particulars do, and the particulars in this instance did not stand up. This is a distinction the Sussex narrative has always blurred, and it matters here more than almost anywhere. There is a difference between a story about the press that plays well in a documentary and a claim about a newspaper that has to survive cross-examination. A public audience can be won with feeling, a judge cannot. The judge in this case went through the material with the discipline the law demands, and the emotional weight of the campaign simply had no place in that arithmetic. The judgment was not a general inquiry into the British press. It decided the pleaded claims before it. On those claims, the court found the required proof of unlawful information gathering had not been established. So a campaign dressed in the grandest possible language still had to prove its own specific allegations, one by one, and it could not. That is not a headline being unfair to Harry. That is the structure of the law doing what it always does. When you build a case on the assumption that everyone will simply believe your version, and then a court asks you to evidence it, the assumption is where the whole thing breaks. And once a case breaks at that point, everything changes. Every pound spent chasing the claim now reads differently. Money poured into a fight that failed on proof is not money spent on vindication, it is money spent on a loss. Which brings us to the harder question, hiding underneath the verdict. If suspicion was never enough, then what, exactly, was the court actually testing article by article? The judgment answers that with a discipline the public campaign never had to show. The court did not treat these articles as a vague cloud of grievance. It examined them with real rigor, looking at contemporaneous records, at documented sources, at the explanations offered and tested against the material. In other words, it asked for the paper trail. Where did this story come from? Who provided it? What evidence exists, at the time, that the route was unlawful, rather than ordinary journalism? That kind of examination is unforgiving, and it should be. A serious allegation against a newspaper deserves serious scrutiny before it is accepted, and this is precisely where a public narrative and a court record part ways. Out in the world of interviews and memoirs, an assertion can stand on its own. It sounds convincing because it is delivered with conviction. Inside a judgment, an assertion means nothing without the record to back it. The court was not there to reward a compelling story. It was there to see the receipts. The judgment's point is simpler and stronger than any panel anecdote. The court did not ask whether the claimants found the stories intrusive, unfair, or impossible to explain. It asked whether they proved that the information had been obtained unlawfully. That is the line between a public grievance and a legal claim. The official record shows why that distinction mattered. The court examined the pleaded allegations against the available evidence. It did not accept suspicion as a substitute for proof, and it did not convert the broader public argument about the press into a finding on individual claims. That is where the campaign failed. The accusation was serious, but the legal burden was serious too. Once the court required evidence rather than assumption, the claims did not survive. Understand what the court was and was not doing. It was deciding the pleaded claims before it. It was not holding a public inquiry into the entire British press. It was not there to validate a years-long grievance or to deliver the moral verdict the campaign wanted. It took the specific claims, applied the specific standard, and ruled. That narrowness is not a loophole. It is the whole point of a court. It decides what is in front of it, on the evidence in front of it, and nothing more. Which is why a legal loss here is a genuine consequence of unsupported allegations, not merely an inconvenient headline to be spun away. When claims fail because the evidence was not there, that failure is the story. It is not bad luck. It is not press bias. It is the predictable result of taking a public narrative into a place that demands more than narrative. This was the moment the campaign met the court record and could not carry it. And once that verdict landed, the dispute did not end. It moved. It moved from the question of who was right to the question of who pays for the whole thing. So what is this second fight actually about? It is about costs, and the setting for it was a consequential cost hearing held on the 29th and 30th of July. This is a normal part of how litigation works. When one side loses, the court turns to the bill, who covers the expense of the process that just concluded. It is not a second trial. It is not a rerun of the merits. The question of whether the claims were valid has already been answered. The cost hearing deals only with the aftermath.
So, this has been a disaster for Harry reputationally and financially, and we may not be through the worst of it yet.
At that hearing, according to Reuters reporting, Associated Newspapers sought its costs on what is called an indemnity basis. Let me translate that out of legal language because it matters. Indemnity costs are a more demanding basis for recovering money than the standard one. Courts sometimes award them when they take a dim view of how a losing party conducted itself. It is a request, not a ruling. Associated asked for it. The court had to decide. But the request itself signals something. The winning side was not looking for a modest, routine recovery. It was pressing for the more aggressive path. This is the part where accountability stops being an abstraction. For years, the argument over this case lived in principle and feeling. Now it is being measured against a concrete decision. The decision to litigate. Somebody chose to bring this fight, to keep it going, to carry it all the way to judgment against a major newspaper group with deep pockets and serious lawyers. That choice had a cost, and the costs hearing is where that choice gets weighed in pounds. The next phase did not reopen the case. It moved to consequence. Reuters reported that, at the later costs hearing, Associated Newspapers asked for costs on an indemnity basis and sought an interim payment. That is a dispute about the financial aftermath of the dismissal, not another chance to prove the original allegations. That distinction matters because a cost hearing can look dramatic without changing the underlying result. The court has already dismissed the claims. What remains is the question of what costs should be paid, on what basis, and in what amount. So before anyone turns £34.5 million into a personal verdict against Harry, the number has to be read accurately. It is a position advanced by Associated Newspapers in a live cost dispute. It is not a final award. Here is the precise version. Associated Newspapers told the court it had incurred £34.5 million in legal costs. That is the sourcing, straight from Reuters' report on the costs hearing. That is what the figure is. It is Associated's stated bill for its own side of a long, hard-fought group case involving 7 claimants and years of litigation. Now the ceiling, stated immediately, because this is where responsible coverage and lazy coverage split. That $34.5 million is not a final award, it is not an order, and it is not Harry's personal liability. Nobody has been told to pay that sum. It has not been divided up and assigned. It is a claimed figure advanced by one side, in a hearing, as the starting point of a negotiation the court will ultimately rule on. Treating it as Harry's bill is simply wrong on the facts as they stand. I want to be blunt about this because the temptation in this space is enormous. It would be easy, and it would get clicks, to say the prince now owes £34.5 million, that he cannot pay, that he is staring at insolvency. There is no basis for those claims. No final cost order has been reported. No personal sum has been fixed. Anyone leaping to bankruptcy is inventing an ending the evidence does not support. And inventing endings is exactly the habit that got this case dismissed in the first place. We are not going to mirror it. So why does the figure matter at all, if it is not a personal bill? Because it defines the scale of what is now in dispute. This is not a small quarrel over a few £1,000s in filing fees. When one side arrives at a costs hearing citing £34.5 million, that number tells you the size of the consequence hanging over the losing claimants as a group. It sets the magnitude of the fight, even as a claimed figure rather than a settled one. It frames just how expensive the decision to litigate turned out to be. There is a version of this story that respects the audience, and a version that flatters it with a fake certainty. The honest version says this: a large sum is in play. It represents the winning side's stated costs. Its final size and its allocation are not yet decided. That is less dramatic than a headline announcing Harry's ruin, and it is also true. The drama here does not need embellishment. A years-long campaign built on grievance was dismissed on proof, and now a cost figure of that magnitude sits over the outcome. That is plenty. Consider also what this figure represents in terms of the original decision to pursue the case. 7 claimants, years of preparation, a high-profile barrister, a case that was built, maintained, and carried all the way to a full hearing. Every one of those steps cost money, and every one of those steps was a choice. The $34.5 million on Associated's side of the ledger is the mirror image of a campaign that was never going to be cheap to fight. When you bring that kind of case and lose, the scale of the other side's bill is partly a reflection of the scale of the fight you chose to pick. That is not a moral judgment, it is arithmetic. But the figure alone is only half of what makes the cost stage bite. The other half is what Associated said about how much of it was actually covered. Because the moment insurance enters the conversation, the headline turns into something with real practical pressure behind it. So why is this costs phase more than a procedural footnote? Because of the gap. According to Reuters' account of the hearing, the claimant group had £16 million of insurance cover. Set that against the £34.5 million cost figure Associated advanced, and you can see the shape of the problem immediately. The cover, if that framing holds, does not stretch to meet the claimed bill. There is daylight between what was insured and what is being sought. Associated also sought a £10 million interim payment, Reuters reported. That was a request to the court, not proof that $10 million has been ordered or paid. The final cost figure remains unresolved, but the request shows the scale of the financial consequence now being argued over. Let me draw the inference carefully, because this is precisely the spot where careless coverage overreaches. If Associated's position prevails, there may be a shortfall between the group's insurance and the costs it faces. That is the narrow, defensible reading. What I am not going to do is take that shortfall and pin it on Harry personally. The case involved 7 claimants. How any liability is ultimately shared, if and when it is fixed, is not something the current evidence establishes. Do not let anyone hand you a tidy figure for what Harry owes. It does not exist yet. What the insurance detail does establish is the practical stakes. This is no longer a philosophical argument about press ethics. It is a question of real money and whether the cover is enough to absorb it. And this is where the consequence of choosing confrontation comes into focus. When you launch an aggressive legal campaign against a well-resourced opponent and lose, the bill does not politely limit itself to what your insurance happens to cover. The practical cost of the decision to fight arrives regardless. The case involved 7 claimants, which is exactly why the public should resist simplistic claims about one person's final bill. The current record does not establish how any eventual liability would be allocated between them. What it does establish is that the costs dispute is collective in origin, because the dismissed litigation was collective in form. So the insurance gap turns a legal headline into a live pressure point, and the interim demand puts a clock on it. But before anyone treats that $10 million as money already changing hands, remember what the other side did next, because the claimants did not simply accept the bill. So has anyone actually been ordered to pay a penny? Not on the evidence reported, and this is the counterweight that honesty requires. The claimant's lawyer challenged Associated's bill directly, describing it as excessive. That is the disagreement in plain terms. One side says the costs came to £34.5 million. The other side says that number is inflated. According to Reuters, the claimants offered £8 million to be paid by the 28th of August. So you have a claimed figure of $34.5 million, an interim request of $10 million, and a counter offer of $8 million sitting on the table. Name that counter evidence accurately because it matters. The amount is contested. The basis is contested. This is not a settled bill being tidied up. It is an active dispute over how much is owed and on what terms, with a gap between the two positions wide enough to drive a truck through. Anyone presenting the $34.5 million as a done deal is skipping the part where the other side flatly rejected it and put a much smaller number in writing. Reuters also reported a detail that tells you where things stand procedurally. Any application for permission to appeal had been deferred until the costs judgment. In other words, the appeal question is parked. The court is dealing with the consequence of the loss first, and the question of whether the claimants can even challenge the verdict is waiting behind it. That sequencing matters. It means the costs decision is the next real milestone, not some distant footnote. Until that written judgment arrives, the numbers being discussed are opening positions, not final answers. Now here is where I want to hold two things in view at once, because both are true. The claimants are entitled to dispute the size of the bill. That is a legitimate part of the process, and $8 million is not nothing. But disputing the bill does not undo the verdict. The disagreement over costs is a fight about the price of losing. It is not a reopening of whether they lost. The merits case was dismissed on the 7th of July. That fact sits underneath every argument about pounds and pence, unmoved by any of them. That distinction gets lost in the noise, and it is the distinction that matters most. A commentator can spend an hour arguing about whether $34.5 million is fair or excessive, and none of that touches the underlying reality. The claims failed on proof. Whether the final decision lands closer to the claimant's reported £8 million offer, A&L's £10 million request, or another figure entirely, the legal position remains the same. The cost dispute exists because the merits claims were dismissed. And that is the part of this story that deserves to be said without softening. Harry walked away from a public role built around military service, charity patronages, and Commonwealth duty, then spent years framing his conflict with the press as a campaign for accountability. That campaign ended in court, where accountability meant evidence. His claim was dismissed because the required proof was not established. Now the costs of pursuing that failed case are being argued in the same legal system that rejected it. That is not brave. That is not standing up for yourself. That is the consequence of choosing confrontation over proof, grievance over evidence, and a public narrative over the discipline a court demands. The costs hearing is not a footnote to the verdict. It is the verdict's natural extension. Every pound now in dispute is a pound that was spent on a case the evidence did not sustain. So the answer to whether anyone has been ordered to pay is, at this point, no final order has been reported. The figure is disputed, and the appeal question is on hold. All of that is genuinely unresolved. What is not unresolved is the verdict itself. And that means the thing that will actually answer the remaining legal question is not a viral post or a panel show hot take. It is the written cost decision when it comes. Let me bring this back to where we started, and to what can honestly be said. The public perception was a number with Harry's name attached, a prince buried under a £34.5 million bill. The private reality, the accurate one, is more precise and in some ways more telling. The court loss is established. It happened on the 7th of July, and the claims were dismissed because they could not prove unlawful information gathering. Suspicion, as the court put it, is not proof. That part is settled and beyond spin. The costs fight is real, and it is serious. Associated has advanced a £34.5 million figure, sought a £10 million interim payment, and pointed to a group insurance cover of $16 million. The claimants have called the bill excessive and offered $8 million. The final amount is not fixed. The personal allocation to any individual, including Harry, is not established. The permission to appeal question waits behind the cost judgment. Those are the things that remain genuinely open, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to give you a cleaner ending. Here is the Glamour report view, stated plainly. A public legal campaign has to meet the burden of proof. These claims did not, and they were dismissed. The cost stage now unfolding is the consequence of a campaign the evidence did not sustain. This is where the gap between public grievance and legal proof becomes impossible to ignore. For years, the story was told in the language of principle and injury. In the one venue that demanded evidence rather than emotion, the story could not stand. That is analysis, not a statement of Harry's final personal liability, and the distinction is the entire point. I am not going to predict financial collapse. I am not going to forecast a marriage crisis, or read the tea leaves on an appeal, or narrate private conversations I cannot see. Those predictions are exactly the kind of certainty this case punished. What I will say is that a chapter which was sold as vindication ended as a dismissal, and the bill for pursuing it is now being argued over in open court. For the next question worth watching, we have covered before on this channel the matter of Harry's earlier legal and royal footing in the UK, and where his public strategy goes from here. Treat that as the next chapter of public strategy, not private motive. Because the pattern that matters is not about feelings behind closed doors. It is about the choice to keep taking grievances into rooms that ask for proof, and what happens when the proof is not there. The headline everyone shared was a number. The truth is a verdict, a disputed bill, and a set of questions the written cost decision has not yet answered. That is the fuller picture, and it looks nothing like the one on the feed. I want to hear your take. Comment below and hit subscribe if you have not already.